Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is nice to see you today in the House. You look very manly this afternoon. Of course, it is my great honor always to stand in this place and to speak on behalf of the residents and the constituents of Edmonton Strathcona, and I am particularly delighted to be standing today and speaking about our sanction regime and the work that needs to be done to strengthen and ensure that our sanction regime is as adequate and as strong as it can be. Because of course we know that sanctions are one of the tools that we have to hold governments, to hold individuals around the world to the rule of law, to human rights, to democracy and fairness and justice for their citizens. It is one of the tools that we have. And I know for a very long time, many members in this place have worked very hard, very well together to try to increase our sanction regime effectiveness, to increase the ability of sanctions to do what we hope that they will do, and that is to change the course of governments and individuals, change their behavior, punish them for their harms that they've caused, without harming and punishing innocent people, without hurting and harming innocent citizens. The act that we're debating today is S-8, and of course this is an act to amend the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act and to make consequential amendments to other acts and to amend the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations. Now, I have to say that this proposed legislation amends the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, or the IRPA, and it will provide Canada with much needed abilities to better link government sanctions with authorities related to immigration enforcement. And I think we can all agree that this means that not only will foreign nationals sanctioned due to the invasion of Ukraine be inadmissible to Canada, but it will also stop all previously sanctioned individuals from places like Iran, Myanmar, Burma, South Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe, amongst others. And I am very supportive of this bill. I think the NDP is very supportive of this bill. But we do need to consider, and most of my comments today will be on the fact that this is only a small piece of what needs to be done to strengthen Canada's sanctions regime. This bill does not fix some of the things that we have been calling for some time. For example, the absence of parliamentary oversight. We have very little parliamentary oversight of our sanctions regime, and I'll certainly be speaking to that a little bit later. This also does not fix the enforcement in areas that are not immigration related. For example, the seizure of assets. Again, I'll speak to this in more depth later on, but I would just raise again in this House that to date, about $121 million have been seized from Russian oligarchs as part of our sanctions regime to force Russia to stop its illegal war in Ukraine. $121 million is an awful lot to me, and it's probably an awful lot to most of us in this room and in this country. It is not an awful lot for Russian oligarchs. And it also does not fix the challenge that we have as parliamentarians with clarity. So we still don't have a good system in this place that will explain why the government chooses to add some people to the list to be sanctioned, how those decisions are made, how the timing of those decisions is made. We know that we work with our allies. We know we work with other countries. That's very, very important for sanctions to be effective. But we do need to have more clarity on how those decisions are being made as parliamentarians. And I will say, as we go forward looking at the sanction regime and strengthening the sanction regime, that there are people in this House that have been doing very, very important work on this. You know, I have to call out my colleague from the Conservative Party, the member for Selkirk, Interlake, and Eastman, for his excellent work on the Magnitsky sanctions. Please do pass that along. I can tell him myself. Also our Deputy Prime Minister, who has done great work on making sure that the Magnitsky Act was put in place. Of course, the challenge of that is, as some people have mentioned before, my colleague from the Bloc mentioned just previously, is that putting something in place, putting a law in place, doesn't actually matter if we are not enforcing it, or if we are not making sure that it is adequately applied. A perfect example of that is that with the Magnitsky sanctions, we are supposed to do a 5-year review. Well, 5 years is 2022, and there is some review being done at the Senate, but we have not done any review within the Foreign Affairs Committee. We have not done any review within this Parliament. So for me, that is a challenge that we have. Now, I spoke briefly about the need to strengthen our sanctions regime. And, oh, just give me 1 second, Minister. I have to, Mr. Speaker. And for years, the NDP have been pushing for a stronger sanctions regime. And we're happy to see some of the important changes that this bill will bring forward. Things that we've asked for years, for several years, including in the 2017 Foreign Affairs Committee study on Canada's sanction regime. Many of the recommendations from that study have not been implemented, and we look forward to the government moving somewhat faster than they have to date to make sure that those are implemented, especially considering that right now what we are seeing in Ukraine is a vital need for sanctions to be a key piece of our response to the Ukrainian war. Another example of why our sanctions regime has not been as effective as it could be is things like the waiver. You know, we did see the government in the summer, in the middle of July, put a waiver in place that would cancel some of the important sanctions that we had put in place that we had against Russia. Now, I'm not going to stand here and pretend that wouldn't have been a very difficult decision for this government to make. You know, we had allies with our German allies and allies with our Ukrainian allies that were asking for different things, and that's a very difficult situation to be in. So while I did not agree with the decision that was made by the government, I do accept that was a difficult decision to make. That said, since then, Mr. Speaker, that pipeline that the waiver was supporting, first of all, was supporting a piece of equipment that was returned to Germany to be returned to Russia. Russia didn't ever pick it up. The second thing is that the pipeline that it was meant to be used on has now since been blown up. So there is really no reason whatsoever for us to still have this waiver in place, to still have this lessening of our sanctions against Russia, but yet we still do. We still have not, the government of Canada has still not canceled the waiver, which is appalling and something that they should be doing immediately. And I know certainly the Foreign Affairs Committee will be recommending that if we can get out of the filibuster that's been put in place by some of our colleagues within the Conservative Party. The other piece that I want to know about with regards to our sanctions regime is how we can double check that what's happening is adequate and it is being done properly. So I talked a little bit about sanctions oversight. We know that after Russia invaded Ukraine in February, that there were sanctions that were put in place. But we also know that those sanctions trickled out after months and months and months. And for many of the oligarchs, they had the opportunity, we learned that they had the opportunity to actually remove their assets from Canada, to move their assets so that they would not be able to have those assets seized. Shame. So that's a missed opportunity when those assets were supposed to go to help rebuild Ukraine, to help with the Ukrainian rebuilding initiatives. We also know that the government has failed to provide that clarity on sanctions that we very much hoped for. For example, multiple times I have asked in this House, but I have also asked using order paper questions to get more information, more details on who is being sanctioned, what is being sanctioned, what has been seized, how it's being seized, what processes are being used. And in fact, I've never been able to get an adequate answer from the government. In fact, one of the order paper questions was returned to me with, and I'm not joking, with the response that said, we aren't 100% sure that we will be able to give you accurate information, so we're going to provide you with no information at all. Interesting tactic. I'd love to see somebody try it in high school or in their university courses. Because I'm not sure I'm giving you all of the information, I'll give you none at all. So that's something that we have some problems with. We still don't have that level of clarity. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have another concern as well. When the government introduced the Budget Implementation Act, the last Budget Implementation Act, there was a change to the way that sanctions were dealt with. So in the past, there was this parliamentary oversight because the government needed to record the use of the sanctions regime or the Sanctions Act. They needed to report that to Parliament. That needed to be tabled with Parliament. In the Budget Implementation Act, that requirement was removed. So now it's no longer the government's obligation to tell the Parliament what those sanctions are, what's been seized.
Sure.
So we could find out if we took the government to court, if we used a judicial remedy for that, but we can't find out through just parliamentary processes. And this is taking away the right of all parliamentarians to have that transparency, have that understanding of how our sanctions are being chosen, how they're being enforced, if they're working. Because, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, a sanction isn't really that useful if it's not being enforced. You know, a sanction isn't really all that important if countries understand or if individuals understand that it won't be enforced in Canada. You know, I have to tell you, there's an interesting thing that I found out as I was doing some of the digging around sanctions. Do you know if you want to find out what goods are coming into Canada from Russia, you can find that out by looking at Russian shipping records. You can't find that out by looking at Canadian shipping records. It's very interesting to me that there is transparency that you can find in the US, the UK, the EU, Russia, but you cannot in fact find here. So that for me is also another challenge I have with our sanction regime. Now, as I said at the beginning, this particular bill does help with some aspects of our sanction regime, and I am very happy to support this legislation. I am very happy to see that it will be fixing some of those holes around our sanction regime. But I will say that this seems very much to me like tinkering around the edges. You know, we have heard from the Senate, one of the key questions, key quotations from the Senate hearings on Bill S-8 from Canada's foremost expert on sanctions policy, Andrea Charon, was, and I quote, "Well, there is nothing wrong with highlighting in the Immigration and Refugee Act that inadmissibility due to sanctions is possible. This repeats a pattern whereby Canada tinkers on the margins of legislation without addressing core policy and process issues. If we are to continue to sanction autonomously with allies, we need to fix fundamental issues of policy and fundamental issues of process." So, Mr. Speaker, I believe going forward that we have many things that we still need to do. We need to have a comprehensive review of Canada's sanction regime. The NDP has proposed a study at the Foreign Affairs Committee on Canada's sanction regime. We are very hopeful that that study was meant to have taken place this fall, during the fall session. We are very hopeful that it'll take place very, very quickly once the winter session begins. Again, I would urge my colleagues within the Conservative Party to stop filibustering our committee so that we, in fact, can get on with the very important work of foreign affairs. We can ensure that our sanctions are being more effectively applied. We can bring forward legislation that would align with the recommendations in the 2017 Foreign Affairs Committee report that calls for greater transparency, calls for a review of our sanctions regime, and calls for a parliamentary body of all parties that would actually assist in identifying which names and which individuals should be on the Magnitsky list and should be sanctioned by the Government of Canada. Because, Mr. Speaker, one of our biggest problems we have, and I've said it many times, is if we can't fix our sanction regime very quickly becomes not as effective and not as useful as we need it to be. And I think members of this House have brought up circumstances where that is the case. You know, we know that, for example, in Ukraine, that sanctions is one of the key tools that we have to hold Russia to account for their illegal invasion in Ukraine. It's one of the key levers that Canada can pull to force the Russian Federation to rethink this horrific and illegal attack on civilians. It's also one of the things that we can use when other human rights abuses are raised around the world. You know, we are seeing horrific attacks on protesters in Iran. Just this morning, I woke up to another horrific example of a protester being executed because he was fighting for his freedom. We know that there are many, many Iranians that are in grave danger right now. And if this sanction regime can be fixed and can help the people in Iran even a little bit, that has to be done. You know, I'm interested in looking at sanctioning a whole range of characters that we know around the world have been responsible for human rights abuses, for atrocious human rights abuses. What we are seeing in Yemen, what we are seeing from members of Saudi Arabia. We need to make sure that we are, as a country, standing up for human rights and using the tools that we have at our disposal for those efforts. And I also want to point out too, well, if I could, that the sanctions regime is a tool that we also have to use for our feminist international assistance policy and for the feminist foreign policy that we certainly hope that the government tables with Parliament very, very soon. We know that the people who are identified by the Magnitsky sanctions and by the SIMA sanction measures, we know that vastly, a huge percentage of those are perpetrating human rights abuses that are disproportionately impacting women and girls around the world. We know that sexual violence, gender-based violence, has been used as a tool to silence journalists, to silence human rights defenders around the world. We know that rape has been used, and this violence does not align with a country like Canada that has a feminist foreign policy, that has a feminist international assistance policy, that needs to be looking at our foreign responses through that lens. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to end my comments today. You know, as I was traveling here from Edmonton, yesterday I took some time to read some of the speeches from the Nobel Peace Prize winners. And I wanted to just read a quote from you, because the quote that I have here from Oleksandra Matvichuk from the Center for Civil Liberties, the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize winner, spoke to me about the need for sanctions and why it is so important that we work with our allies and that we work to make our sanction regime stronger. And the quote is this: "Peace, progress, and human rights are inextricably linked. A state that kills journalists, imprisons activists, or disperses peaceful demonstrations poses a threat not only to its citizens. Such a state poses a threat to the entire region and peace in the world as a whole. Therefore, the world must adequately respond to systematic violations. In political decision-making, human rights must be as important as economic benefits or security. This approach must be applied in foreign policy." Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Bravo.